we're going to go ahead now and talk about how to construct a confidence interval. And to do that, we need to understand what is a confidence interval first before we show you the actual process. A confidence interval is made up of two values, right? It's made up of a point estimate with what we call a margin of error, right? And that margin of error, which we'll talk about soon, gives us an interval estimate, right? It's an estimate like between 120 and 150 minutes versus someone saying, I think it takes 132 minutes, right? Using these two values. That's a point estimate. This is an interval estimate. So a confidence interval is what we call an interval estimate. What we had been doing in the past are point estimates. We're getting a single value. Now a confidence interval, right, now we know it's an interval estimate, is made up of two values, a lower bound and an upper bound, as it's described here. And we'll learn how to calculate those two values given our sample data. And the second part of a confidence interval is our level of confidence, right, as a percentage. We're 90% confident that the values between this and this. We get this level of confidence back to kind of our normal distribution, and standard deviations is connected to that idea of standard errors and how far away from the center do we want to be. So we'll come back to this idea. Now, calculating the interval requires a point estimate and a margin of error. Now, keep in mind the margin of error is not a mistake. The error is probably a bad name for it. It's really the margin of variability, right? When you collect data, there's a lot of variation in the data, and that error comes from this variability. And we calculate this variability based off the standard error, right? Like the standard deviation. And we have a sense of how wide this variability is. And that's where the margin of error comes to. So it's not really a mistake. And so make sure you make a note of that. Now, looking at this example here, here's an example, right, without the calculations, but a poll announces, right, and this is happening at any election cycle, especially presidents, you see these polling data. The president has a 40% approval rating with a 5% margin of error. You'll see news organizations oftentimes omit this, but there's always some margin of error with any polling data. In this case, the point estimate is 40%. The margin of error is 5% plus or minus, meaning the real, right, approval rating somewhere between 35 and 45%, as this calculation you can see, right? It's the lower bound is 40 minus 5%. The upper bound is 40 plus 5%. And so you have this general structure for a confidence interval, point estimate plus or minus your margin of error. And sometimes we use the capital E to represent that. And notice we have kind of different notations. Sometimes you'll see the inequality notation. Your proportion is between 35 and 45%. Or we use what's called interval notation, which we learned in a previous module earlier on. Parentheses 0.35 comma 0.45. This would be what we call interval notation. Let's look at another example before we actually show you how to calculate the margin of error, right, using statistics. Here's an example where we're looking for the true mean time that people spend brushing their teeth. You collect some data, you have an average, and you have a margin of, a margin of error. And so looking at different answers, right, with this average and a margin of error, we are going to estimate that the true mean, right, time that people spend brushing their teeth is between 47.3 and 49.5 minutes. And I should have the units here. Seconds. You need units. Every number means something. So seconds should be as part of the units here. And so that's what we're looking at, right? When we're calculating our notations, we write, look at the mu symbol that represents the mean, right? That's the population mean that we're trying to estimate. And notice here, how do we calculate the point estimate? Well, the point estimate is the sample mean. The point estimate is the sample proportion. Those are the point estimates. What we need to learn out is how to calculate margin of error.